Hi, I'm Rocket, and welcome to Whiteboarding with Rocket. In today's session, I'm going to take you through the recording use case for whiteboarding. Let's talk a little bit about why you would use a recording with whiteboarding. So one of the number one reasons is to convey a very complex concept for many people to see. Something that people can go back and watch, something that I'm not going to say is timeless, but it is an entertaining and interesting way to understand a concept. Now, I will say all of these concepts do not necessarily replace writing of documents. These tend to be a little bit more ephemeral, meaning they're a point in time or there's something you use to convey some complex subject, and then you go back and you write down what that complex subject is. So another use case here is to bring people up to speed to a common ground or a common understanding. This is really effective when you have potentially a number of people that are going to be coming in and out of some effort you're running or a part of. And you want anybody new coming in to be able to accelerate quickly to understand what's going on. And especially if it's a fast-moving situation where documentation in the written word may get out of date and you want to do something that's like, hey, this is where we were, this is where we're going, show you some visuals, and then move on. Very, very effective way to do that. And another use case is for recording of this, or another purpose is doing checkpoints or statuses. Now, checkpoints and statuses are good when if you've got some document you're tracking progress on, you can send that out. And if you feel like there's a big milestone or a big complex hairy challenge that's in front of you and you want people to understand that, using a whiteboard recording is a way to do that. There are a number of constraints you have to think about when doing a video recording of a whiteboard. Let's talk about some of those. One is your distribution. This is probably the number one thing. Everything else, okay, you can get over, but how you get people access to the video file is one of those things. Your mileage will vary on this, and you have to think through how is it you want to get the video file to your customer. Physical setup. There's constraints in the physical setup. For example, the size of your room. Right? I'm lucky enough, I've got a small office area where I can mount a camera and I can have a whiteboard and I can put some lighting in and do some other interesting things. You may not have that luxury. But I can tell you, as long as you have space for a whiteboard, using something like an iPad to do a video or an iPhone to do a video recording is very effective, and it's almost end-to-end self-contained. The next set is your feedback loop. How do you want to get feedback? The one thing I do want to recommend is if you're doing something you're looking for feedback on, make sure that the elements that you've outlined on your whiteboard are clearly labeled or annotated in a way that people making comments can refer to so that we all understand what's going on. It's a little bit of a trick. It takes a little bit of time, one or two or a few of these to do, and then all of a sudden you're like, I'll just make sure I label it. You can label it in a different color. You can put some kind of moniker on the whiteboard to make sure labels are clearly understood. Lastly is your learning curve. And I will tell you that the physical setup is relatively straightforward. As long as you can get a camera or an iPad and connect it into the system and hit record and you got decent sound, that's easy. The hard part comes when you have the video that you've recorded and now you need to edit it. And you need to make sure that the microphone levels are correct, and you need to make sure that the color looks good and the brightness is right and your lighting is helping. That's where a very interesting learning curve happens. I will say there are very simple, straightforward options out there, and I will cover those as part of this video. For our next section, I'm going to cover an HDMI camera-centric view of this world. And what I mean by that is the camera that you're going to connect to is going to be HDMI-based. Here are the elements that you're going to be concerned with. First of all, your physical setup. That goes without saying. Your whiteboard and your lighting. You got to make sure you got that right. Next is your camera. So the one requirement to the camera is it has two requirements. It has an HDMI out and it has a clean feed in HDMI out. There's a good number of cameras that range to the crazy amounts of investment. There are some really, really good middle-of-the-road cameras that don't cost a lot that will work for this. The two that I talk about are like a mirrorless or DSLR version, and then you have like a camcorder version, like Canon or Sony camcorder. The mirrorless ones are where things can get pretty expensive when you talk about all the lenses and the bodies and the options and blah, blah, blah. So I have a handful that I want to recommend. They're a little bit more than like the bargain basement ones, but they're ones that will last a really long time. I am not going to talk about some of the super high-end ones because that's just, if you have access to those, great. But in this case, no. When it comes to the camcorders, there are some very good camcorders, the Handycam style, that work really well in this setting. The one thing you're going to want to make sure of is it's got good, clean brightness so that you're not, the shadows are taken care of, and good lighting will help with that. All right, so now that we've got a camera, now we need a way to mount it, all right? One straightforward option is to get a tripod, put the camera on top of it. There you go, it's mobile. You move it around, as long as you can connect the camera into your laptop, and I'll talk about a couple of options there, you're good to go. You can also get a little bit more sophisticated and have something like a clamp with an arm and put the camera on top of the arm and have a little bit more stationary, and you get some more interesting options like higher angles. Next is your microphone. Okay, a microphone is very important from audio quality. So it's said that 80% of a good video is good audio. And I can attest to that for a lot of different reasons. If it's hard to understand you, if it's hard to interpret what's going on, if your voice is muddled or distorted, it's not a great video. It's not a good experience. And no matter how awesome the color, awesome the video is, it's going to be a suboptimal experience. So there's a lot of different options when it comes to audio. You can connect, straight away, you can use the HDMI or camcorder's audio. You're going to get okay. One of the things you have to worry about is echo and resonance and a few other and volume and stuff like that. But there's options in post-processing where you can boost that. You can also get things like a small shotgun mic that mounts on top of your camera. Those are relatively inexpensive, and they point right at you and they take your voice, and this is, it's a pretty effective way to do it. Another option is to get something like a wireless lavalier mic and connect that into your camera. And they're not super expensive for the investment, and they have good quality sound, and you put them on you clip them onto your lapel or your shirt, and off you go. Where you plug the microphone into there's a number of options. Like I said, you could plug straight into the camera and that go into your system. You could also plug the audio into your computer and directly, and then use it that way as well. Okay, so next is your input switching. When it comes to HDMI input, if you can plug directly into your computer using an HDMI to USB capture card. These are not very expensive. They're less than $100 usually, and they're effective enough if you have a single camera. You're gonna get the two cameras, right? Then you think about the hardware switch, because a hardware switch can have 4 to 8 HDMI inputs, and you just push a button and it switches between them. And what comes out of the hardware switch is like a USB-C connection into your computer, and that shows up like a webcam and a microphone. So those are the differences there. So a hardware setup, more elegant, right? These are about $100 a piece. The ATEM minis range from 300 for the most basic up to just under 1,000 for a super advanced one if you need lots of inputs and lots of options. Next is your recording software. Now, recording software with an HDMI in is, you get two options. One is OBS, which is the open broadcast software. And you set it up to record. When you launch the system, it's going to ask you, are you doing live streaming or are you doing recording? If you do recording, it will optimize your hard drive and optimize the CPU so that when it records, it does its best not to drop frames or cause problems. So the one thing you've got to watch out for there, you need a decent system, right? Test it out. That's what's beautiful about this. It's free. You test it out. You see if it's going to work for you, and if it doesn't, then you look for other options. There are hardware recording options. An option is to not actually get into your computer, all right? You can just use your HDMI camera and an SD card and record straight to that, as long as your microphone is plugged into the camera or you're using the external mic on your camera. Great. You can hit record on the camera. When you're done, pick up the SD card, get it into your system, and go from there. So that is definitely an option as well. Next, and probably the most complex piece of this entire equation, is your video editing and production. With the HDMI version, what you're going to end up with is a video file, in whatever format you decide, that you now need to transform into something that can be uploaded to work docs or broadcast. You're likely going to want to put a little bit of, you're going to want to check it out. You're going to want to check to make sure the levels are good, that the lighting's okay. If you need to add titles or credits or any of those kinds of things or disclaimers, you can do that with video editing software. If you have a Mac, you can just use iMovie. It's one that comes out of the box. It's decent enough. It'll work for you. And as I'll talk about when I go through the iPad version of this, it's also a self-contained unit when it comes to editing on iPads or iPhones. Another option, and one that I enjoy when it comes to recording for screens, is Camtasia. This is from Techsmith. Really, really good at very straightforward editing of videos and adding titles and transitions and things like that. You can also run Camtasia on Mac or on Windows. Another option when it comes to video editing is Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve. I recommend this for folks who are a little bit more advanced when it comes to the video editing and want more control. I don't recommend, if you're new to this video editing thing, I don't recommend starting with DaVinci. It's very complex. It's a full-featured software. It is free, which is very nice. There's a $300 version. I don't recommend investing that $300 until you get to a point where you're like, I know what all those features are when I lay that $300 down, and I need those features. It runs on Windows, macOS, and Linux. So once you've gone through this video editing process, you now need to produce something to upload. All of these options have ways to produce optimized files for that. Next up is an iPad-centric view of this workflow. This turns out to be very effective and one that I recommend as a great place to start. The investment is really with the iPad itself, and there's a variation in iPad quality. You can do this with an older generation iPad that has 256 gigabyte drive space and be perfectly okay. So this can be from like a 2018 iPad generation all the way up to the most modern iPad Pros. So you don't have to spend a huge amount of money or invest a lot here. It can be less than $500 and you can get going. You don't have to do cellular, any of that kind of stuff. So it's an interestingly effective option. Now, you can go as full-blown as one of the more modern iPad Pros with the terabyte and all the USB-C connections are really, really powerful. And you can set up something, you can evolve this. Let me say it that way. You can evolve this very broadly. And with a keyboard and a touchpad, you can end up doing some pretty amazing things. And it actually, in some cases, is even better than working on your Mac or a PC. So let's talk through what that looks like. It's a much more simplified view, by the way. So in this case, you of course have your whiteboard and your lighting set up, your physical environment. Then you have an iPad, and you want to mount that on something. And you've got the same options as you would with an HDMI camera. You have your clamp and your arm, and you can have an iPad holder, right? Or you can have a tripod with an iPad holder. Then you need a microphone. Now, there's two options here. You could use the iPad microphone. Now, if you're close enough to the iPad, that's going to be effective. But any kind of distance, you're going to get a little bit of echo. It's going to be a little bit quieter. You're going to have to increase the volume, and what you're going to get is a background hiss when you do that increase of the volume. So my recommendation here is to get these wireless lavalier microphones, relatively inexpensive. They have a little 2mm connector that you plug into the iPad. So you could have just some Airpods, Bluetooth on there, and off you go. That's also a very good option. So then the camera, in this case the iPad, goes straight to editing, right? There is no worrying about the input switching or the recording. It's all done with the iPad. So once you've recorded your video, you would then use iMovie if you wanted to stay native to the iPad. There's also other video editing software solutions out there for iPads that are centered on iPad. You could export the video to Camtasia, to your desktop, and then use things like Camtasia to edit it, or even Blackmagic DaVinci. Now, I haven't, as part of this conversation, I haven't covered the high-end versions, the Final Cut Pro, the Adobe Premiere Pro, right? I haven't touched on those because I think that's, if you have access to that and you know it, go with it. I'm not going to recommend that from the beginning on this because those are investments in learning curve and in software, and I don't know if we really need to do it. The Blackmagic DaVinci, it's free and it is as functional as those other solutions. So I think these are some really good options. To sum up, we've covered several scenarios around options for recording a whiteboard. I find this to be an incredibly effective way to communicate. I've started with a very simple setup and I've evolved it over time, taking notes, documenting all the different configurations that I've used, and finding a way to make this very efficient so that I can create a whiteboard video and record it, edit it, and publish it in a very short amount of time. This has taken a lot of effort to learn and get skills, and I know I'm still a newbie. But I know if I can do it, you can do it as well. If you wanted a place to start, I'd start as simple as possible, a webcam and a whiteboard, and record that. If you happen to have an iPad, get an iPad. I do recommend either using your Bluetooth headphones and microphone or getting an external microphone for your iPad. With that, happy whiteboarding. I'm Rocket. This has been another Whiteboarding with Rocket.